Welcome to this explainer. You know, if you crack open almost any standard history book, you'll probably be told that major Indian resistance to British rule pretty much kicked off with the Great Mutiny of 1857. But as we dive into the actual source material today, we're going to see a very different story. We're going to uncover an entire, completely forgotten century of history. Let's dive right in.
So, the big question we really need to ask is, when did the resistance to British rule actually begin? We're always hearing about 1857, but the reality is way more complex, and honestly, a lot more fascinating. Today, we're exploring a hidden, blood-soaked century of fierce defiance that started decades earlier. We're talking about a continuous chain of resistance that fired up the very second the British East India Company started asserting territorial control.
Section 1, Beyond 1857, Early Resistance.
What's really wild here is how the historical sources redefine who was actually doing the fighting. When historians talk about the people's resistance during this era, we aren't just talking about a handful of disgruntled farmers. Take a look at this coalition. We're looking at a massive, complex cross-section of society. You've got artisans, tribal communities, dispossessed ruling classes, thousands of demobilized soldiers from former royal armies, and even religious leaders. This was a broad spectrum of people whose entire lives, status, and livelihoods were being completely upended by an alien rule.
You can really see how wild this dynamic is when you put them side by side. On one hand, you have dispossessed zamindars and polygars. These are traditional landlords and local chieftains who lost their land and their sovereign rank. And on the other hand, you have artisans and the urban poor, who are completely ruined by the destruction of handicraft industries and crushed by heavy taxes. A displaced traditional landlord had vastly different daily grievances than an impoverished artisan, right? But the colonial extraction was so intense they both quickly found a common enemy in the East India Company.
Section 2. Who fought and why?
To understand why these vastly different groups took up arms and risked absolutely everything, we have to look at the sheer list of grievances. And it is staggering. The British didn't just take over the administration, they fundamentally rewired the economy to extract maximum wealth. They slapped on crushing land revenue settlements that led to mass evictions. They pushed their tax administration deep into tribal lands, stripping tribal people of their ancestral rights. They deliberately devastated indigenous handloom industries with heavy export duties just to promote British goods. And underneath all of this economic ruin was a deep psychological grievance. The foreign character of the rulers and their contemptuous treatment of the native people deeply, deeply hurt their pride.
All of this built into an inescapable trap. It was basically a brutal economic domino effect. Step 1. Colonial policies systematically ruined Indian handicrafts. Step 2. The traditional patrons who used to actually buy these goods, like the princes and zamindars, disappeared because they were losing their wealth to the British too. Step 3. Millions of suddenly unemployed artisans had literally no choice but to migrate back to agriculture just to survive. Which leads us to Step 4, an enormous, devastating pressure on agricultural land that created rural misery on a scale no one had ever seen.
Section 3. The Civil Uprisings. This immense pressure across all levels of society resulted in what historian Bipan Chandra classified as civil uprisings. And when you map out the sheer density of these revolts, it's mind-blowing. From 1763 all the way to 1820 and beyond, violent uprisings were erupting constantly. You've got the Sanyasi Revolt in 1763, the Polygar Revolt in 1795, Velu Thampi's resistance in 1808, the massive Paika Rebellion in 1817, and the Wagaras rising up to 1820. These weren't just isolated blips. They were overlapping wildfires burning across completely different regions of the subcontinent, from the deep south to the eastern coasts.
Section 4. Sanyasis and Southern Polygars.
Let's zoom in on a couple of incredibly compelling stories from this era, starting with the Sanyasi Revolt in eastern India. This revolt raged from 1763 all the way to 1800. It was essentially triggered by a catastrophic famine in 1770, combined with incredibly harsh British economic exactions. Imagine the desperation here. Hindu and Muslim ascetics, who were originally peasants themselves, teamed up with a massive influx of evicted farmers, disbanded soldiers, and the rural poor. Together, they formed this formidable force that spent nearly 4 decades violently raiding East India Company factories and treasuries. It actually took prolonged military action by Warren Hastings to finally subdue them.
What's really fascinating about this, which is sometimes called the Paika Rebellion, by the way, is the remarkable unity. The historical source specifically notes the equal participation of Hindus and Muslims fighting side by side. Plus, it highlights leaders like Debi Chowdhury.
Her involvement is a huge deal because it explicitly recognizes the absolutely crucial role that women played in these dangerous early resistance movements against British power.
Now let's jump all the way down to the south, where a totally different group faced their own existential threat. Enter the polygars. Think of them as fiercely independent territorial holders. For generations, they had controlled small clusters of villages granted to them by traditional rulers in exchange for military service and tribute. They saw themselves as independent, sovereign authorities within their own lands.
So how did this blow up? Well, in 1781, the Nawab of Arcot handed management of these provinces right over to the East India Company. Suddenly, the polygars lost their sovereign status. The new English tax collectors didn't respect their traditional rank at all. In fact, they aggressively treated the polygars straight up as enemies. This profound disrespect and sudden loss of autonomy pushed leaders like Katabuma Nayakan to launch a stiff, decade-long armed insurrection against the British.
Section 5. The Great Paika Rebellion. Perhaps the ultimate climax of this early wave of resistance happened in Odisha in 1817. This is a story of total societal mobilization. But to get why it was such a big deal, you first have to understand the Paikas. They were the traditional foot soldiers of Odisha. For generations, they'd lived securely on rent-free lands, basically a hereditary reward for their military and policing services. But when the English company formally conquered Odisha in 1803, they just completely stripped away the power, the prestige, and the land security of the Paikas.
And the British didn't just tick off the military, they poured gasoline on the fire for literally everyone. They implemented extortionist land revenue policies, they dethroned the local Raja, they heavily taxed everyday necessities, which caused a massive spike in the price of salt, and in a spectacularly disastrous move, they abolished the local cowrie currency and demanded that all taxes be paid in silver. I mean, imagine asking for silver from common masses who strictly use local cowrie shells. It was an absolute disaster.
To put a human face on this relentless exploitation, let's look at the leader of the rebellion, Bakshi Jagabandhu. He wasn't just some commoner. He had been the highly respected military chief of the Raja's forces. But by 1814, the East India Company had outright seized his ancestral estate, reducing a once proud military commander to absolute penury. Imagine your entire livelihood and ancestral home just vanishing overnight. He literally had nothing left to lose.
So in March 1817, a tribal community called the Kones arrives in the territory, and Jagabandhu completely seizes the moment. He rallies this massive, diverse army of Paikas, peasants, and local zamindars. The uprising was so fierce, they literally set the whole province in arms and forced the East India Company to temporarily retreat. When the British inevitably returned with overwhelming force, the Paikas shifted to relentless guerrilla tactics. This incredibly bloody fight, known as the Paika Bidroh, was only brutally repressed by the end of 1818.
Section 6. A Century of Defiance.
From the Vagara chiefs in the west to the Dewan Velu Thampi down south, looking at the big picture, there's a very clear pattern here. These civil uprisings were highly localized. They were almost always led by semi-feudal, traditional leaders, deposed kings, landlords, military chiefs. Because of that, the movements were definitely backward-looking. Their primary objective wasn't to create some modern democratic nation. They just wanted to expel the alien rulers and fiercely restore the old traditional world order they had lost. But man, despite that traditional focus, their defiance was absolute.
This specific detail from the historical record gives me chills because it reveals the true depth of the anti-British sentiment. Following the Paika Rebellion, Jagabandhu became an outlaw. The British offered vast, life-changing rewards for his capture. But in spite of all that wealth being dangled in front of them, not a single commoner in the province betrayed him or the other guerrilla leaders. Not one. That profound loyalty tells you everything you need to know about how deeply rooted the hatred for British rule had already become, decades before 1857. Which leaves us with a massive question to wrap up on today. We've just walked through an entire forgotten century of bloody, localized, but absolutely relentless defiance. So, considering the continuous squeeze of colonial extraction and these constant fires of rebellion burning from 1763 onwards, was the massive subcontinent-wide explosion of 1857 truly a surprise to anyone paying attention, or was it simply the absolute inevitable climax of a century of rage? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history you've been taught.